The instant I knew I had been locked out will never fade. One of those terrible days at work when everything seemed to go wrong and I just wanted to get home, put on some sweats, and zone out in front of the TV. Arriving, I took my keys and tried to open the front door. Still, my key would not turn. Not sure, so I tried once more. Same outcome. That is when I observed something unusual. Beside the entrance stood many suitcases. Closer inspection revealed they were my baggage. For a minute I just stood there gazing at the heap of my life that had been thrown outside the house I believed was my home. My clothing, some personal items, and even my laptop were sloppily packed into a suitcase placed on the front step like garbage. The truth hit me hard. The locks had been changed. As the rage surged within me, my heart sank. What was occurring was beyond belief. There was no warning or discussion. Simply my belongings tossed out like I was a stranger they no longer needed. I grabbed my phone and tried to call my husband Jake right away. Not responded. When I phoned once again, it went right to voicemail. It was exactly his usual avoidance of conflict, always. Half hoping he would call back with some explanation, as if everything had been a misunderstanding, I fixed my phone. Of course, nothing though. Knowing his mother Linda and his sister Amanda had never liked me, I knew his silence indicated there was no mistake. However, I didn't believe they would really go this far. Jake had been far off recently, spending less time with me and more time with his family. I told myself over and over that it was only a passing storm. But this is different. Modifying the locks without even informing me? It was terrible validation that things had become beyond fixable. They no longer wanted me there. So I started loading my luggage into my car and attempting to force down the emotional tsunami growing inside me. Though I was furious, that is, rather angry, the total sensation of shame and betrayal was far more powerful. Then I noticed it crumpled on one of the boxes, a message. It advised not to come back. Here we no longer want you. Only those chilly last words, no signature. I had no option but to go. I gazed at the message in bewilderment as the truth of what had transpired really hit in. But I couldn't help but wonder how things got this awful as I drove off. Completely locked out of the life I thought we were creating together. How did I find myself in this state? I was wounded, angry, and most importantly, devastated. I did not want to return to my parents. Not since I married Jake and moved out. I hadn't visited in years. Returning now seems like acknowledging my failure. But except that, what other choice did I have? I booted off like I was nothing and shut out of my own house. Overcoming my pride, I decided to head back to my parents' house. The road seemed never-ending. I continued racing over everything in my thoughts, trying to make sense of how my marriage had collapsed so totally. I felt entirely numb by the time I got to my folks' place. Trying to get the bravery to approach their front door, I spent several minutes seated in the car. Having to explain all of this to them disgusted me. I knocked, but I had no other option. When my mother answered the door, she didn't need to probe one single question. Her facial expression captured it all. She noticed the bags and the hurt in my eyes, and she moved aside without thinking to let me in. What went on? Her voice was subdued. I couldn't respond straight away, though. "They kicked me out," I said, my voice shaking as I uttered the words aloud for the first time. My throat felt tight, and the tears I had been keeping back since seeing my stuff on the front step suddenly burst free. When I packed my belongings or saw the message, I hadn't shed tears. However, everything came gushing out when I stood there under the protection of Mom's arms. Unable to stop as the weight of the treachery and grief struck me all at once, I wailed like a child. My mother simply embraced me and let me let it out. "It's just what I need." We stood there for some time, she clutching me and me crying. When I at last cooled enough to talk, I tried to explain. They tossed my belongings, revised the locks. "You don't have to go back," she stated firmly. "I don't even know what to do now." It was consoling to hear, but also difficult to accept that you are remaining here as long as you need to. Not meant to be back here. This was not meant to be my life. The discomfort of the circumstances started to seep in as I settled into my old bedroom. The room had not changed at all. It was like returning to the past, only I had changed when I moved out years ago. Everything felt like it belonged to someone else, someone younger and more optimistic. The posters on the walls, the bedspread. But that person was no more. I felt like a failure sitting on the side of the bed gazing at the room. How had my life descended like this? When I married Jake, I had been very convinced we would create a future together. Later that evening, my mom came on the door. It seemed as like that future had been snatched away, and I had no clue where to turn from here. "Can I visit?" she asked softly. Not very eager to discuss, I nodded, knowing I couldn't avoid it indefinitely. She sat next to me and cast that worried, motherly glance. "Are you game to discuss it?" Still attempting to sort things, I sighed. I said, "I really have no idea what to say. All of it occurred really quickly. I am locked out of my own house one minute I'm at work." She shook her head, her attitude softening. "My stuff is on the porch. I don't even live there anymore. Why they would do that to you is beyond me. You have always been nice to them." That struck me more strongly than I had anticipated, since it was accurate. For Jake's family, who paid for things they couldn't afford and volunteered whenever they needed it, I had bent over backward. And this was how they paid for it? By tossing me without even a conversation, whispering, the hurt obvious in my voice. I believed I was doing everything correctly. My mom clasped my hand and gave it a reassuring stroke. "I worked hard, paid for everything, helped them out, and this is what I get in return." "Sweetheart, you did nothing illegal. Sometimes individuals exploit others who treat them kindly. It's not your fault." I nodded, but her words did not really comfort me. Jake kept me from stopping to ponder. Why had he not halted this? Why never did he defend me? I felt as though I no longer even knew him. The following several days passed in a haze. Processing all that had occurred, I was attempting to decide what to do going forward. Though I could sense they were just as bewildered as I was, my parents were encouraging. After not living with them in years, none of us understood how to handle this new circumstances. Eventually, my dad brought me down at the kitchen table. "What do you have in mind?" he inquired, looking at me seriously only when he meant business. "Are you going to attempt working with Jake to mend things?" Not wishing to answer that question, I fixed my attention on my coffee. As it happened, I knew nothing. Things seemed so shattered, I could not even start to consider how to mend them. "I don't know," I said softly. "I'm not sure whether I should go back. I'm just tired. Jake seems to have been allowing Amanda and his mother to manage our lives. Weary of feeling like I don't matter, that I'm just there to pay the bills and keep things running while they do whatever they want." My dad nodded, his forehead wrinkled in worry. "You have been bearing a lot of weight on your own. That is not how marriage is meant to be." I groaned, the weight of his comments sinking over me. She was correct, hoping things would get better. I had been carrying too much for too long. But he added softly, "You don't have to go back if you don't want to. You should be with someone who appreciates you, who supports you." I hadn't considered it like that before. Maybe it's time to consider what's best for you if Jake isn't that person. I hadn't really given what I wanted any thought since I had been so fixated on making things work. For the first time, I came to see that I had alternatives. I was spared having to continue with this. If I wanted to, I could escape. That awareness was both horrible and freeing. The days following my return in with my parents were unusual. For so long, I had been caught in a loop of trying to make everyone else happy. But now, maybe it was time to consider what would make myself happy. I felt as though I was in some strange twilight, not sure where to go next. Being away from Jake and his family's relentless demands was a relief on the one hand, but there was still residual guilt in the back of my mind. Like perhaps I ought to have been working more aggressively to mend things. Every time I considered returning, though, I remembered how I had bent over backward for them, helping them financially, handling their passive-aggressive remarks, and how little they valued any of it. Jake's sister Amanda and mother Linda always had something to say, always made me feel inadequate. I worked long hours to support us, but they often made comments about how I wasn't a proper wife. And Jake? Well, he just let it go. He never raised a protest for me. I had spent years persuading myself that things would improve, that he would finally intervene. But it never occurred. I had room to breathe, to contemplate at my parents' house. I stopped worrying continuously about someone begging me for money or berating me for working for the first time in what seemed like eternity. Though that peace was often disrupted by my own thoughts, Thoughts of whether I had made the right decision by leaving, whether Jake would even bother trying to fix things. About a week after I had moved in, I was sitting on the couch mindlessly viewing some reality show when my phone buzzed. I looked down and noticed on the screen Jake's name flashing. My tummy turned around. I hadn't spoken to him since I left, and just seeing his name set off all the feelings I had been trying to suppress. I didn't answer straight away. Rather, I fixed my attention on the phone, a million options running through my head. Was he phoning to be forgiven? In order to guilt-trip me back off? I knew nothing, and to be honest, I wasn't ready to learn. Although the conversation ended on voicemail, he left no message. Moments later, a text appeared. "We have to discuss. Please." My pulse thumping, I gazed at the message for what seemed like an eternity. He did not express regret. Not even did he recognize what had transpired. Just, "We have to chat." That all he had to say after everything? I could not muster a response. Feeling overwhelmed, I threw my phone on the couch and headed outside for some fresh air. I wasn't ready to handle that talk yet. As I sat down on the porch steps attempting to clear my brain, the cool evening wind brushed across my face. When I was younger, I used to sit here wondering what the future contained. After a few minutes, I heard the door creak open behind me. Here, 35 years old, I was once more seated on my parents' porch trying to decide what my next action would be. Not saying anything first, my dad left to sit next to me. He has always known when I need time, when to chat, when to simply be with me. He looked over after some time and asked, "You okay?" Still up in the heavens, I shrugged. "Jake texted me," I murmured softly. He nodded as though he had expected it. "Based on what did he say?" I said, feeling the irritation build up inside me. "He wants to talk." But he didn't apologize. He spoke nothing of apologies for whatever transpired. My dad groaned and massaged the back of his neck. He merely said we needed to chat. "Emily, if you're not ready, you don't have to chat to him. You are aware of this, right?" Though it didn't seem so straightforward, I knew. Part of me wanted to phone him and yell, asking him why he allowed things to get so terrible and why he let his mother and Amanda treat me like trash. But another side of me refused to cope with it. "You've always been too forgiving," my dad remarked after a time, breaking the stillness. I was tired, exhausted from battling for a relationship that seemed one-sided, from always being the one who had to solve things. Not that it's a bad thing, but sometimes people take advantage of that. His words hit hard because they were true. Keeping the peace with Jake's family, holding things together. I had spent so much time trying to make everyone else happy when none appeared to care about me in return. I believed that's what I had to do to keep my marriage intact, so I let them walk all over me. "I feel like I wasted so much time trying to fix things," I said, just above a whisper. My dad answered softly, "You stayed because you cared. I don't even know why I stayed as long as I did. But caring doesn't mean you have to keep putting yourself last." We watched the sky darken and quiet for a little. This was the sort of silence that seemed consoling rather than unsettling. I did not feel the need to have all the answers for the first time in a very long time. I was not under pressure to solve things immediately. The next day I answered Jake's SMS at last. I said succinctly, "Right now I'm not ready to chat. That is it. Not extensive explanation, not overanalyzed, just the reality." I pushed submit and waited. It took him many hours to reply, and when he did, the message was more drawn out. Though he expressed regret for what transpired, he refused to take any accountability. Rather, he blamed Amanda and his mother, as they had thrown my belongings out and changed the locks while he had no say over the matter. It was usual Jake, always deflecting, always making it appear as though he was only caught in the middle of everything, instead of owning up to his part in it. I ignored. I wanted more time to consider, and to be honest, I didn't want to find myself pulled back into his justifications. The following several days I tried to concentrate on myself. I wasn't ready to forgive him, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. I went on lengthy walks, spoke with my parents, and first started considering what I wanted in years. It was peculiar, liberating, but somehow terrible at once. I had totally neglected to consider what I wanted. I had been so long ensuring everyone else was fine. As more time went by, I realized I didn't want to go back. Now, I had a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms, and however daunting it was also thrilling. Not after all that had occurred, I did not see how things might improve. Yes, Jake remarked in his communications. However, I had heard it all before. One day, I was out running errands and found myself parked outside a coffee shop, simply looking out the window, lost in contemplation. Actions speak louder than words. His actions had repeatedly told me that he was not willing to defend me when it counted. I considered what it would be like to be gone from him permanently, to go on and start again. Since we had no children, things were easier, but divorce still sounded frightening. Though as I sat there, I considered everything I had given for him and his family and how little they had valued any of it. Nobody gets married expecting it would end like this. It was emotional tiredness, not only about time or money. I had given so much, they had given little in return. I looked over past texts between Jake and me and saw the same trends. He would ignore me every time I mentioned how I felt. He would vow things would change whenever I urged him to step up. But it never happened. That was when I realized I had been tricking myself into believing things would get better, when in fact they never would. I found it impossible to hang on to the vision of our marriage as it could be. I had to deal with what it really was. A relationship in which I was doing all the effort and he was only traveling alongside. Though it was difficult, I knew what I had to do. The next morning I got down with my parents and shared with them what I had been considering. My mom offered me a gentle, comforting smile. "I think I'm going to leave him," I murmured softly, not sure how they would respond. "I'm proud of you," she added. "Making a decision like that requires a lot of guts." My dad nodded in accord. "Emily, you have done everything you could. Walking away sometimes is the finest thing you can do." Their encouragement was precisely what I needed to hear. It seemed like a weight from my shoulders had been gone. A few days later, I contacted Jake. I had no idea how much I had needed that affirmation until that point. That was not a lengthy discussion. I told him I wanted to start the process of splitting, that I needed to move on, and that I doubted we could mend things. I wasn't anticipating that when there was a delay on the other end of the line, he would just say, "I get it." Though part of me had braced for him to protest and ask me to remain, he did not. Perhaps deep down he realized this was the only path ahead for both of us. The next several weeks were occupied with the pragmatic details of divorcing, organizing our belongings, processing documentation. Though it was difficult, every action helped me feel a bit more in charge of my life. Though sad, sure, it was also freeing. And perhaps that's what I discovered most from all of this. Occasionally, you have to let go of something to find yourself again. I was different from me when I married Jake. I had matured, I have evolved, and now I was ready to go on my own terms. Life started to seem different, but in a positive manner. In the weeks after my announcement to Jake, I was leaving. It seemed as though I was gently recovering bits of myself I had lost over years. Sure, it wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time I felt like I was going on instead of caught in this never-ending cycle of trying to mend things that couldn't be solved. I still hadn't heard anything from Jake, and that was really a welcome relief. Beyond that, there was little contact. We had taken care of the basic things, sorting through our joint accounts, deciding what to do with our stuff, but not much. Though I wanted to believe it would continue that way, I knew there would be one last chat. He had accepted that I was leaving, at least on the surface, and we were keeping things calm. One more effort on his part to try to persuade me differently. Sure enough, it arrived 2 weeks after I had formally informed him I was done. Friday night, I was lying on the couch with my mother watching some old movie we had watched a million times before. My phone buzzed, and down I glanced to see Jake's name. "Hey," I said, attempting to keep my voice quiet and steady. "Hey, Jake," I said, pausing momentarily before picking back up. After a protracted silence, he spoke once again at last. "Could we get together to discuss? I simply need to meet you personally." The request did not surprise me. Though it made nothing easier, I knew what was coming. Part of me wanted not to see him, and wanted not to revisit scars that were at last beginning to heal. Still, another side of me knew I had to face. "Yeah, we can meet," I answered after a pause, not knowing how to escape this. "Tomorrow?" We decided on a time and location after he answered, "Yeah, that works." Although the talk was brief, I could sense the desperation he was attempting to suppress in his voice. The next day, I headed to the cafe we had decided upon. I arrived a bit early, my stomach napsers the entire journey. When I stepped in, Jake was already seated at a table next to the window, appearing more anxious than I had ever seen him. I wasn't sure how the discussion would go, but I was resolved not to allow myself get caught back into that poisonous loop again. When he spotted me, he smiled weakly. I did not reciprocate. I was not present for politeness. "I just don't understand how things got this bad," Jake remarked, running a hand through his hair. This was about closure, and I needed to keep my focus on that. I sat down across from him and we shared a quick, awkward welcome before getting into the subject. I felt we were doing really well. I shook my head, a familiar annoyance rising inside me. "Jake, we haven't been okay in a long time. You let Amanda and your mom treat me as though I never existed. You never raised a protest for me. It was years of this, not just the previous few months." He scowled, obviously not expecting me to approach him so squarely. "I knew I made mistakes," he said. Still, I didn't believe it was this severe. "You always say that, Jake." I groaned, feeling the weight of his comments fall over me. "We could still mend things. Though nothing ever changes, you always vow you will repair things. Years of waiting for you to intervene and perhaps notice what I have been struggling with. Never did you, though." His face sank, and I could see the remorse all over it. "I cannot keep waiting for you to decide I matter. But guilt was insufficient these days. I need more than just apologies and hollow pledges. I knew I needed action, and he had never been ready to offer that." "I know," he whispered softly. "I realize I did not do enough. Sure, I was terrified. I had no idea how to confront Amanda and Mom. I shook my head once more, not knowing how to juggle everything. That is not a justification, Jake. You are meant to be my spouse and partner. Though you did not, you should have had my back from the start. I'm done. You let them stroll all over me. I can't keep doing this." He sat there momentarily, gazing down the table with palms tightly clenched. "So, that's it? You're just done?" I stared him squarely in the eye. "Yes, I'm done." The stillness that followed was weighty, but not embarrassing. He continued, his voice barely audible above a whisper. "I don't want to lose you. The type of stillness that results when something finally breaks. That which you have been clinging to for too long." I took a long breath, attempting to control my feelings as I don't know how to make this right, but I want it to end different. The part of me still loving him that didn't want to hurt him was starting to show signs of grief. "I don't want to hurt you either, Jake," I murmured gently, knowing I couldn't allow that side of me guide this choice. "But I have been struggling for some time. You haven't been the spouse I needed, the one I have been waiting for to stand up for me. More than that is due me." He didn't not say anything for a long time, but sat there, his head bent. "I deserve someone who appreciates me, who fights for me, and I don't think you are that person." With his voice quivering, he nodded at last, as if he was at last grasping what I had been trying to express for years. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know. I truly am. But it's too late." We sat in quiet for a few more minutes, neither of us sure what to say. Sitting across from him, thinking this was the end, felt unusual. At the same time, though, I felt relief that I was at last acting for myself. "I think it's time for us both to move on," I whispered softly. "We need to let go." He nodded, however I could see the grief in his eyes. After some more quiet, we rose up and he reached out for a hug. "Yeah, I guess you're right." I paused for a second, then entered his arms. When I left the cafe, I felt a peculiar mix of emotions: sadness, relief, closure, a brief bittersweet hug, a farewell to what we once had, but also an acknowledgement that it was gone. Though at the same time I knew this was the correct decision, it was difficult to let go of the life I had imagined living with Jake. That night, I sat on my parents' porch once more, the cool evening air enveloping me like a consoling blanket. I was bored with clinging to something that wasn't working. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I considered everything that had happened, the years I had spent trying to make things work, the emotional toll it had taken on me, and the knowledge I deserved better. Though I had no idea what the future contained, one thing was clear. The weight of a marriage that had been progressively stifling me was no longer bounding me. I had my life back and was ready to go on. Over the next several days, I began to give what I desired more careful thought. Having not had the opportunity to concentrate on myself in so long, it felt as though an entire universe of possibilities had become available now that the weight of my marriage was offloaded. Though I wasn't sure precisely what my next moves would be, I knew I was not returning to the status quo. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with my mother, she glanced at me and asked, "So Emily, what's next for you?" Knowing I still had to learn, I gently smiled. "I'm not sure," I answered, "but I'm willing to work things out." That uncertainty didn't terrify me for the first time in a long time. It felt liberating, as if I was at last entering my own life on terms that fit me. There is no waiting, no more expecting for things to turn around. Now I was in charge. All that counted was that finality of it all. That last chat with Jake at the cafe seemed like a chapter of my life closed. Though more than anything, it was liberated. It was also sad. The expectations of others or the ongoing strain to mend a marriage that had been disintegrating for longer than I would care to admit did not drag me down. Years of attempting to fit into Jake's world and into his family's expectations had gone toward me, trying to be someone I wasn't. Now, for the first time in what seemed like eternity, I was standing on my own. The days began to merge, but not in a negative manner. Nowadays, life is neither chaotic nor fast-paced. The simplicity of every day started me in a routine. I wasn't rushing into anything. I woke up, helped my mother with little chores around the home, went for long walks in the neighborhood, and gently began to piece together what my new life may look like. It was a relief to just be after years of ceaseless effort to keep everything together. I had no need for a strategy or for knowing exactly what was ahead. It was enough for now to let me recover and to go one day at a time. One afternoon, I was sitting in my old room, organizing the items I had brought back from the house with Jake. Many of it was simply clothing and miscellaneous objects. Buried under all else were fragments of a life I had tried to create, a life that no longer suited who I was. Old photos of Jake and me from our first meeting, back when everything looked so straightforward, caught my eye. Knowing how much had changed, it seemed odd to view those pictures today. I spent a lot of time staring at one photograph, trying to recall what I had felt in those days. Contentment, prospect, perhaps. That side of me, though, appeared like a whole different person, smiling at Jake. She was someone who thought everything would always turn out and that love could solve any difficulty. Now I was not that person. Looking at the images, I was not upset. I had matured, evolved, and discovered that love was insufficient if it lacked respect and mutual effort. I was not consumed in resentment or remorse. I felt instead a subdued acceptance. That aspect of my life was finished. I was ready to let it go, not out of grief, but rather out of closure. I carefully put the pictures back in the box. A few days later, I made a major decision, something I hadn't truly thought about until now. Instead of continuing to hang on to the past, one morning as I sat at the kitchen table with my mother, I glanced across at her and said, "I think I'm going to move out." She stopped, her coffee cup halfway to her lips, and smiled gently. "You sure are ready?" I nodded, saying, "I think so." It is time. I had to start reconstructing my own life. It wasn't as though I hated spending time with my folks. My rock through all had been them, and I was glad to be in a familiar location while I mended. Still, I realized that remaining there too long would leave me mired in poverty. I craved my own freedom and space. My mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I had turned on them for support, and now I was ready to stand on my own 2 feet once again. "Emily should be proud of herself," she remarked. Her comments made me cry, but not the type of tears caused by suffering. "You have come so far, and I know you will be okay." Over the next several weeks, I began searching for a modest apartment close by. These were tears of thanks for recognizing how fortunate I was to have parents who supported me no matter what. While I wanted to avoid waiting too long, I also wanted not to jump into anything. Not too far from my parents, I came into a lovely 1-bedroom apartment that fit exactly. Though not particularly elegant, it was just what I needed. Starting again seems like a big stride ahead. Moving in seemed like. It was about recovering my life, not only about getting my own room once more. Over the first several days, I cleaned, arranged, and gradually transformed the place into something like home. Though each box I opened seemed like a little triumph, a sign that I was moving on, it was a slow process. Once everything was arranged, I sank down on the couch in my new living room and inhaled deeply. Though little, that place belonged to me. No family conflict, no demands from others, no pressure to be anything except me. I felt in charge of my life for the first time in a long time. Naturally, there were times when I would consider Jake. That was only logical. We had spent years together after all. Still, such ideas no longer depressed me. The agony and annoyance that had dogged me for so long did not apply. I had no resentment for him anymore. I was not very depressed either. Though it had taught me so much about myself, I was in a sense appreciative of what I had gone through, since I knew I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I had come out on the other side, made tough choices, and confronted some painful realities. And now, I was ready for whatever happened next. One evening, I considered the future while seated on the balcony of my new apartment and watched the sun go beyond the horizon. Though I had no idea exactly what it contained, I was not terrified of the unknown for the first time in a very long time. Actually, I was very thrilled about it. Now it was all about me. I had forgotten what it was like to dream for myself. I had spent so many years linked to someone else's life and plans. What did I wish for? For what reason was I delighted? These were questions I hadn't questioned myself in quite some time, but now I could investigate them at will. I had no hurry into anything. The following several weeks were a blur of adjusting to my new life. I could take my time, work things out, and go at my own speed. I discovered a career I enjoyed that provided me fulfillment and direction apart from a relationship. Looking back on everything, I saw how much I had changed. I reunited with old friends, spent more time with my family, and let myself savor the small pleasures that had formerly felt so far out of reach. The woman who had felt imprisoned in her own marriage was gone, replaced by someone more confident of herself, stronger. Though it had not been simple, I had managed it. And suddenly I was free. My history no longer weighed me down. I had released the guilt, the annoyance, and the melancholy that had dogged me for so long. And in its stead, I had discovered calm. I grinned as I sat on my balcony, seeing the last of the light vanish below the trees. I had found me once more. The past was behind me, and the future was wide open. I had no idea what it contained, but for the first time in a long time, I was thrilled to learn. That was enough. I was prepared for whatever was next.